There are places that exist quietly on maps, and then there are places that seem to exist more in whispers than in geography. Bohemian Grove is one of those names that keeps resurfacing in late-night conversations, documentaries, and fragments of old reports that never quite line up perfectly. It sits in Northern California, surrounded by redwood trees so dense they almost feel like they are holding something in. Over the years, it has been linked to discussions about power, private gatherings, and decisions made far away from public view. Some call it harmless tradition, others see patterns that feel harder to ignore. And maybe that is where the fascination begins, not in what is proven, but in what is unclear, in the gaps between statements, in the way certain roads, certain names, and certain historical figures seem to circle back to the same quiet place again and again, as if drawn there without explanation, under the slow sound of rain and distant wind. There are forests that feel older than the idea of ownership itself. The redwoods around Northern California are like that. They don't announce themselves. They don't need to. They simply exist in layers of time that make human history feel small, almost temporary. Somewhere inside that kind of landscape, Bohemian Grove sits quietly, not hidden in the way people imagine hidden things, but absorbed into the trees, as if the forest decided long ago not to comment on what happens inside it. If you look at it on a map, it doesn't stand out at first. A patch of land, a retreat area, a private stretch of woodland, but maps don't carry atmosphere. They don't carry the weight of stories that have been repeated for decades in different voices, each one slightly uncertain, each one filling in gaps the last one left behind. Bohemian Grove is often described as a private camp, operated by the Bohemian Club, a social organization with roots going back into the late 19th century. That much is documented. What sits around it, though, is where things become softer, less defined, more dependent on who is telling the story and why. And maybe that is important to remember here. Not everything unclear is hidden, and not everything repeated is true. Still, people tend to notice repetition. The idea of powerful individuals gathering away from public spaces has always carried a certain psychological weight, not because it automatically implies wrongdoing, but because humans are naturally sensitive to what they cannot observe directly. When something important happens behind closed doors, the imagination does not stay still. It fills the silence with possibilities, sometimes calm, sometimes uneasy. Bohemian Grove, in that sense, is less a single place and more a long-running question. A question about privacy, about tradition, about who gets to gather away from scrutiny, and why that idea itself feels so charged in modern times. The club's history is often described in fairly ordinary terms at first glance: social gatherings, artistic circles, networking among influential figures. In older eras, these kinds of private clubs were not unusual. In fact, they were part of how many social and professional relationships formed before digital transparency changed the expectations around visibility. But time changes how we interpret those same structures. What once felt like routine exclusivity now feels, to some people, like something more layered, not necessarily because the facts changed, but because the surrounding world did. Information became faster, visibility became expected, and anything that remained out of view started to feel more significant than it might have in another century. Inside the redwoods, during summer gatherings, reports and descriptions over the years have mentioned a temporary encampment, cabins, pathways, open-air stages, a place built not as a permanent city, but as something that appears and disappears in rhythm with the seasons. That detail alone creates a kind of mental contrast. Temporary spaces used by permanent institutions. And the mind tends to linger on contrasts like that. Because it raises quiet questions. Why there? Why that kind of isolation? Why a forest so dense that even sound feels different when it passes through it? But if you slow down the thinking and you don't rush toward conclusions, another perspective appears as well. Humans have always created spaces away from everyday life. Retreats, monasteries, mountain lodges, private estates. Places where conversation changes because the environment itself changes. In those settings, people often believe they think more clearly or differently or more freely than they do in public environments. Whether that leads to anything meaningful or not depends on the people involved, but the pattern itself is not unusual in human history. Still, Bohemian Grove remains interesting to people precisely because it sits at the intersection of normal structure and unusual exclusivity. It is not fully secret. Its existence is known. Its general location is known. Some of its history is documented, and yet it is not fully visible either. Not in the way modern life usually expects things to be visible. That in-between state is where curiosity grows. And in quiet moments, especially late at night, when the mind is already leaning toward slower thoughts, that curiosity can start to feel like something deeper than it actually is. A kind of narrative gravity, pulling unrelated details into the same orbit. And without realizing it, the forest becomes more than a forest in the listener's mind. It becomes a setting for questions that don't always need answers, but often demand them anyway. The redwoods do not respond to any of this. They simply continue standing, as they have for centuries, absorbing wind, mist, and silence in the same way they always have. And somewhere within that silence, the grove continues to exist as a place people talk about more than they see. A place that is real. And also, for many people, still not fully explained. The interesting thing about places like Bohemian Grove is that most of what people think they know about them doesn't come from direct experience. It comes from fragments, a sentence in an article, a short clip in a documentary, a quote repeated without its full context. Over time, those fragments begin to feel like structure, even when they aren't fully connected. And the mind rarely waits for full structure. It builds its own. That's part of why the Grove sits so comfortably inside conspiracy theories for sleep content and late-night discussions about hidden institutions. It is not because there is one single confirmed narrative that explains it. It is because there isn't, or at least, there isn't one that feels complete enough to close the subject. So the subject stays open. Open subjects tend to attract interpretation. Historically, the Bohemian Club itself is often described as an exclusive social organization formed in San Francisco in the 1800s. Its membership has included people from business, politics, journalism, and the arts. That mix alone is not unusual for elite clubs of that era, but the continuity of its existence into the modern age gives it a kind of weight in public imagination. Because continuity implies survival, and survival of private institutions through changing political and cultural eras naturally raises questions in some minds, even when there is no direct evidence of anything unusual happening inside them. The summer encampment at Bohemian Grove is usually described in relatively simple terms in official accounts. A retreat, a place for members to gather, events, performances, conversations, but what people tend to focus on is not the official description. It is the idea of what cannot be observed from outside. That gap between description and visibility becomes the entire story for some observers. And once that gap exists, it tends to stay open. Over the years, various journalists and researchers have visited or reported on the Grove from outside perspectives, and those reports have sometimes added detail, but rarely complete clarity. What is consistently agreed upon is that it is private, seasonal, and restricted to members and guests. Everything else becomes interpretation layered on interpretation. And interpretation, when repeated often enough, can start to feel like fact even when it is still just inference. This is where human psychology becomes important to understand. The brain is not comfortable with missing information in stories that feel significant, so it compensates. It connects unrelated dots. It assigns meaning to timing, proximity, and repetition. A name appears in multiple places. A location appears in multiple narratives. A private gathering becomes a symbolic anchor point for broader concerns about power and secrecy. Not because those connections are confirmed, but because the mind prefers connection over fragmentation. Bohemian Grove, in that sense, functions less like a single subject and more like a mental placeholder, a space where different fears, questions, and curiosities about influence and privacy get temporarily stored. And the forest itself remains unchanged by any of it. The redwoods do not reflect speculation. They do not respond to attention. They do not amplify or reduce meaning. They simply stand in their own timeline, indifferent to how human narratives move around them. Meanwhile, the idea of the grove continues to circulate outside the forest, shaped more by distance than by access. And distance, especially in modern times, has a strange effect. It makes ordinary things feel incomplete, and incomplete things feel significant. There are names that seem to appear more often than coincidence should comfortably allow, and then there are names that only feel that way because the mind starts noticing patterns after it has already decided something is worth noticing. Bohemian Grove sits right inside that tension. Not because every claim about it is verified, and not because every association is meaningful, but because over time, the same categories of people tend to surface in conversations around it. Politicians, business leaders, cultural figures, people who already exist in public awareness for entirely separate reasons. And when those separate paths briefly overlap in one private space, even if only socially, the imagination tends to extend the line further than the evidence actually goes. That is usually where the uncertainty begins. Historically, the Grove has been linked in public reporting to members of elite social circles in the United States. Some of those names are well documented through membership lists, biographies, and journalistic references over decades. Others are mentioned more loosely, often without clear sourcing, which is where confusion slowly starts to build. But even the confirmed parts are enough to create a certain kind of public curiosity. Because visibility changes perception. A private gathering involving influential people is not unusual in itself. Similar structures exist in many countries and historical periods. What changes the emotional response is not the structure, but the combination of exclusivity and influence. When those two things meet, people start asking questions that go beyond the surface description. Not necessarily because something hidden is proven, but because access is limited. And limited access always creates space for interpretation. Over time, Bohemian Grove became part of a wider cultural conversation about elite networking and private decision-making spaces. In that conversation, names matter less as individuals and more as signals. Each appearance becomes part of a larger mental map people build to understand how influence might circulate outside formal systems. But that map is not always accurate. Sometimes it is only emotionally consistent. Still, certain historical figures have been associated with the Bohemian Club through verified records and public reporting, especially in earlier decades when social clubs played a more central role in elite networking. These associations are often cited in discussions about how business and political relationships were formed in less formal environments. And this is where things become complicated, not because the facts are hidden, but because they are partial. A partial record invites completion. And the human mind is very willing to complete unfinished stories. So when a name appears in multiple contexts, even if those contexts are unrelated in substance, the repetition begins to feel meaningful, especially in environments where secrecy, privacy, or exclusivity is already part of the narrative. It is not always about what is proven. It is about what feels connected. And feeling in these cases often travels faster than verification. Bohemian Grove, because of its long history and private nature, becomes a kind of anchor point for those feelings. A reference node where broader ideas about power networks, influence, and hidden social structures are projected. But projection is not evidence. It is interpretation layered over distance. And distance, again, is the key factor here. Because most of the conversation about the Grove happens far away from it, not inside it, not from direct participation, but through reports, summaries, second-hand accounts, and fragments passed through time. And fragments, no matter how accurate individually, rarely tell the full shape of the thing they came from. When people talk about Bohemian Grove in the context of conspiracy theories for sleep, the conversation often drifts away from what is actually documented and moves toward what feels symbolically important. That shift is subtle. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, through repetition and association. A place becomes more than a place. A gathering becomes more than a gathering. And the names attached to it start carrying meanings that extend beyond their original context. This is where historical reality and narrative interpretation begin to overlap in a way that is hard to separate cleanly. In the case of the Grove, there are decades of public curiosity surrounding who attends, what happens during the seasonal retreat, and how decisions might be influenced by informal environments. Some of that curiosity is based on legitimate questions about how private networks function in any society. Some of it, however, grows from incomplete information that gets amplified over time. What makes this more complex is that many influential individuals do participate in private clubs, organizations, and retreats that are not open to public observation. That is not unique to Bohemian Grove. It is a broader feature of elite social structures across different countries and eras. But Bohemian Grove carries a particular weight in public imagination because it is visually tied to something very specific: the redwood forest, the isolation, the seasonal gathering, the idea of a temporary world existing inside a permanent one. That contrast tends to stay in people's minds longer than factual descriptions do. Over the years, journalists and researchers have attempted to document aspects of the Grove from the outside, and sometimes from limited access. These efforts have produced descriptions of events, performances, and traditions associated with the gathering. Yet even with reporting, there is always a boundary between what is observed and what is inferred. And inference is where interpretation begins to grow again. For example, when powerful individuals are seen in the same place, the natural human instinct is to ask what decisions, if any, are influenced by that proximity. In formal settings, those decisions are documented. In informal settings, they are not always visible. That gap does not confirm anything specific, but it does create room for speculation. And speculation, once it becomes widespread enough, starts to develop its own internal logic. It begins to reference itself. One claim leads to another. One assumption reinforces a previous one. Over time, the original uncertainty that started the conversation is no longer the focus. The narrative built around it becomes the focus instead. Bohemian Grove exists inside that process in a very stable way. Not because it is proven to be something extraordinary, but because it is structurally suited to becoming a symbol for questions about power, privacy, and influence. And symbols are not required to be fully understood to remain powerful. They only need to remain open enough for people to keep projecting meaning onto them. Meanwhile, the actual place remains relatively unchanged in its documented form: a private retreat, a long-standing organization, a seasonal gathering in a remote forest. These are the consistent points across most reliable accounts. Everything beyond that depends on how much weight is given to interpretation versus documentation. And in quiet moments, especially when the world feels uncertain or too complex to fully map, interpretation often feels easier to hold than incomplete facts. That is usually where the Grove continues to exist in public imagination. not as a fully defined reality, but as an unfinished question that different people answer in different ways. And the answers rarely agree. There's something unusual about the idea of a place that exists only at certain times of the year, as if it has its own rhythm that doesn't fully match the world around it. Bohemian Grove is often described in exactly that way, not as a permanent city or institution you pass by every day, but as a seasonal gathering space that appears, activates, and then disappears back into the forest when the events are over. That cycle matters more psychologically than it might seem at first. Because the mind treats temporary things differently. They feel less stable, less explainable, more open to interpretation. The summer encampment is typically associated with members of the Bohemian Club gathering for a private retreat in the redwoods of Northern California. Over time, descriptions of this retreat have become part of a broader cultural conversation about elite social spaces and how influence moves through informal environments. But what is actually known remains fairly grounded. A private location, restricted access, organized gatherings among members, events that include talks, performances, and social interaction. None of that on its own is unusual in the context of long-established private clubs. What makes Bohemian Grove different in public perception is not the structure, but the visibility gap around it. People can see that it exists. They can identify the general location. They can read historical references, but they cannot observe it directly in real time. And that gap changes everything. It allows imagination to fill in the silence. Over the years, that silence has been filled with many different interpretations. Some are cautious and academic, focused on understanding how elite networks function socially. Others are more speculative, connecting the Grove to broader theories about hidden decision-making spaces or informal influence networks. But even the most grounded accounts often return to the same core tension. What happens in spaces where powerful people gather away from public scrutiny? Not necessarily in a suspicious sense, but in a structural sense. Because human institutions do not operate only through formal channels, they also operate through relationships, and relationships are often built in environments that are not fully documented. This is not unique to Bohemian Grove. It is true of many private retreats, clubs, and conferences throughout history. The difference is that most of those spaces do not become symbols in public discourse. A Bohemian Grove did. And once something becomes symbolic, it stops being interpreted only as itself. It starts representing something larger. In this case, it often represents the idea of hidden proximity, the idea that important conversations might happen outside visible systems, the idea that influence can exist in spaces that are not transparent to the public eye. Whether or not those ideas are accurate in any specific claim is often secondary to the emotional logic they create. Because the emotional logic is simple. If something important is happening and it is not visible, then people will try to imagine it. That is how uncertainty behaves. And uncertainty is the environment in which Bohemian Grove exists in public thought, not as a fully defined event, but as a recurring mental image that changes depending on who is thinking about it. Some see tradition, some see exclusivity, some see secrecy, and many simply see a question that never fully resolves itself. Meanwhile, in the physical world, the forest continues its normal cycle: rain, mist, stillness, and seasonal change. The grove appears within it for a time and then recedes again, leaving only trees and silence behind. But in conversation, it never really disappears. It just becomes quieter. When people try to understand Bohemian Grove from the outside, they often focus on what might be happening inside the boundaries of the forest. But there is another layer that is just as important and often overlooked. It is the culture of secrecy itself. Not secrecy as something dramatic or cinematic, but secrecy as a simple condition, a door that closes, a boundary that is respected, a space where participation is limited by membership rather than public access. That kind of structure exists in many parts of society, from professional associations to academic retreats to private conferences. Most of the time, they do not attract widespread speculation. They function quietly, without becoming symbols. Bohemian Grove is different because of what it represents in the public imagination. Over time, it has become a reference point for discussions about elite gatherings, not just as a specific place, but as an example of how private influence networks might operate in general. Even when details are unclear or partially understood, the idea of the Grove has taken on a life of its own. And once an idea becomes stable enough in public thought, it starts to carry its own momentum. People begin to attach new meaning to it without needing new evidence. This is how narratives evolve in slow layers. A historical club becomes a modern talking point. A seasonal retreat becomes a symbol. A private forest gathering becomes a lens through which broader questions about power are examined. None of this requires anything unusual to be happening inside the grove itself. It only requires that the grove remains partially unseen. Because partial visibility is enough. It is enough to sustain curiosity, enough to sustain speculation, enough to allow different interpretations to coexist without fully resolving into one agreed explanation. In that sense, Bohemian Grove is less important as a location and more important as a mental framework people use when thinking about private influence. Frameworks tend to outlast facts. There have been attempts over the years to describe what attendees experience during the encampment. Reports mention organized events, speeches, artistic performances, and long-standing traditions that have been repeated over decades. These descriptions, while sometimes detailed, still only capture snapshots. They do not capture the full continuity of the experience. And continuity is where meaning often forms. A single event can be explained. A long tradition becomes harder to summarize without interpretation. That is why conversations about the Grove often drift into broader themes. not because the facts are absent, but because the facts are incomplete when taken alone. The human mind tends to bridge that incompleteness with narrative. It connects isolated points into something that feels like structure. And once structure appears, even informally, it becomes difficult to unsee. But it is important, especially in quiet reflection, to remember that structure in thought does not always mean structure in reality. Sometimes it is just the mind organizing uncertainty into something easier to hold. Bohemian Grove sits inside that space between observation and imagination. A real place documented and historically referenced. And at the same time, a story that changes depending on who is telling it. The forest itself does not clarify this tension. It does not resolve it. It does not lean toward one interpretation or another. It simply continues existing, unaffected by the narratives built around it. And over time, that silence becomes part of the story too. Not as evidence of anything hidden, but as a reminder of how easily distance can turn into meaning. There is a certain kind of space where nothing official is written down, yet things still seem to move forward as if something unspoken is guiding them. Bohemian Grove often becomes part of that conversation, even if indirectly. Not because there is confirmed evidence of decisions being made there in a formal sense, but because it sits inside a broader idea people have about how influence sometimes works outside visible systems. In reality, most large societies operate through layers. Formal institutions handle laws, policies, and public processes. But beneath that, there are always informal layers, relationships, introductions, shared histories, and private conversations that never enter public records. This is not unique to any one country or group. It is a general feature of how humans organize power and trust. And it is within that general pattern that places like Bohemian Grove become interesting to people. The Grove is often described as a private retreat for members of a long-standing social club. Within that structure, it functions like many other exclusive gatherings throughout history. People meet, talk, attend events, and participate in traditions that have been maintained over time. But because the attendees have often included individuals from influential sectors, the imagination naturally extends beyond what is directly observable. It begins to ask what kinds of informal exchanges might happen in environments where hierarchy is softened and privacy is guaranteed. This is where the idea of quiet agreements sometimes enters public discussion. Not as a documented fact, but as a conceptual concern. Because humans understand that trust is often built in informal settings, and where trust is built, coordination can follow. Sometimes that coordination is harmless, sometimes it is procedural, and sometimes it is simply social. The difficulty is that none of this is visible from the outside in real time. Only outcomes are visible, and outcomes rarely include their full origin story. Bohemian Grove becomes a symbolic example of this gap between process and visibility. Not necessarily because it operates differently from other private institutions, but because it is more widely discussed than most. Over time, this discussion has blended together several ideas that are not always connected in practice. Private gatherings, late networkings, historical continuity, informal influence, and the uncertainty of what happens when these elements overlap in spaces outside public observation. When these themes are combined, they can create a sense of hidden structure even when no single piece confirms it. This is where interpretation begins to take on a life of its own. And once interpretation stabilizes, it starts to feel like knowledge, even if it is still only inference. Bohemian Grove, in this sense, is not just a location. It becomes a reference point for thinking about how influence might move in environments that are not fully visible. And that reference point persists because the underlying questions it represents are not easily answered. Questions about access. Questions about proximity. Questions about how much of social and political life depends on spaces that are not publicly observed. The Grove does not need to provide answers to those questions in order to remain part of them. It only needs to exist as a real place that is partially outside public view. And that alone is enough for the mind to continue returning to it. When people talk about Bohemian Grove in quieter conversations, away from headlines and documentaries, the tone often shifts. It becomes less about certainty and more about structure, less about what is proven and more about how influence tends to behave when it is not being watched directly. That shift is important. Because the moment a subject leaves formal reporting and enters reflective interpretation, it stops being anchored to a single version of events. It becomes something more flexible, something shaped by assumptions, gaps, and prior beliefs about how the world works. Bohemian Grove sits exactly in that space. Not fully explained, but not fully unknown either. That middle ground is what keeps it alive in discussion. In formal terms, the Grove is a private seasonal gathering associated with a long-established club. That fact is consistent across most reliable descriptions, but what people tend to focus on is not the structure itself, but what the structure allows. A controlled environment, limited access, repeated attendance by individuals who already operate within influential fields. None of these elements are unusual on their own. They exist in many professional and social contexts. Conferences, retreats, private forums, and closed-door summits all function in similar ways. The difference is that most of those spaces are not culturally amplified into symbols. A Bohemian Grove is. And once something becomes a symbol, it starts absorbing meaning from outside itself. This is where the idea of quiet agreements often gets discussed in a more abstract sense, not as a specific claim about the Grove, but as a broader reflection on how humans coordinate influence without formal documentation. In reality, much of society depends on informal alignment. People trust people they know. Decisions are influenced by relationships built over time. Opportunities often come through networks rather than systems alone. None of that requires secrecy, but it does require proximity. And proximity is often invisible to the public. That invisibility is what creates interpretive space. When people cannot observe the process, they infer it from outcomes. And when outcomes are complex, those inferences multiply. Bohemian Grove becomes part of that multiplication process because it represents a setting where proximity is guaranteed, but transparency is limited. This does not mean hidden decisions are confirmed. It means the conditions for speculation are structurally present. And those conditions are enough for narratives to form and persist. Over time, different narratives attach themselves to the same core idea. Some focus on tradition, some focus on exclusivity, some focus on power dynamics in general, but they all orbit the same central feature: separation between observer and participant. That separation is the real source of fascination. Not necessarily what is happening inside, but the fact that it cannot be fully observed from outside. And when something important feels partially out of reach, the mind does what it always does. It fills the space with meaning. Sometimes that meaning is cautious. Sometimes it is imaginative. Sometimes it is suspicious. But it always reflects more about the need for understanding than about the certainty of the subject itself. Bohemian Grove continues to exist at the center of that interpretive loop. A real institution rooted in documented history. And at the same time, a persistent idea that changes depending on who is thinking about it. And in the quiet of that uncertainty, it remains unresolved, not because it is necessarily hidden, but because it is never fully complete in the way people expect clarity to be. Some ideas don't survive because they are proven. They survive because they are easy to imagine. Bohemian Grove has, over time, become one of those ideas in public discussion. Not a single claim, not a single event, but a layered collection of interpretations that sit on top of a real location in Northern California. And once that layering begins, it rarely stops at one level. People start with the known facts: a private club, a seasonal gathering, a long history stretching back over a century. These are grounded in documentation and public records. But then something else begins to happen. The mind starts asking what those facts feel like when placed together. A private forest gathering, influential attendees, limited access, repeated tradition. Individually, none of these elements are unusual in historical or social contexts, but together, they create a certain kind of atmosphere in the imagination. Not evidence, an atmosphere. And atmosphere is where interpretation grows. This is often where symbolism enters the conversation around Bohemian Grove. Not because the grove was originally designed to represent anything beyond itself, but because human beings naturally assign symbolic meaning to spaces that are both real and partially unseen. When something is visible but not fully accessible, it becomes a screen for projection. People begin to place their own questions onto it. Questions about power. Questions about influence. Questions about what happens when decision makers gather outside formal environments. These questions are not unique to Bohemian Grove. They appear in discussions about many private institutions, from financial conferences to political retreats to academic think tanks. But the Grove remains one of the more persistent reference points in conspiracy theories for sleep content and late-night narratives, because it carries a very specific combination of traits. It is real. It is private. And it is long-standing enough to have accumulated history across multiple generations. That combination makes it stable in imagination. Even when details are added or removed over time, the core idea remains recognizable. A gathering in a forest, power in proximity, and silence between accounts. Over time, symbolic interpretations have attached themselves to that structure. Some come from documentaries, some from books, some from fragmented reports or personal commentary, and some emerge simply from repetition across internet discussions, where ideas are passed along faster than context. In those spaces, meaning often becomes compressed. A complex institution is reduced into a simple image. And that image begins to carry emotional weight. But emotional weight is not the same as factual clarity. It only reflects how strongly an idea resonates, not how accurately it describes reality. Bohemian Grove exists in that tension between resonance and reality. A documented place that has been interpreted far beyond its physical boundaries. And the more it is discussed, the more those interpretations begin to accumulate on top of each other like layers of sediment. Until eventually, what people are reacting to is no longer just the Grove itself. It is the idea of the Grove. And ideas once formed tend to outlast the details that created them. Sometimes a story doesn't become stronger when more information is added. It becomes stronger when a few fragments are seen at the right moment, in the right emotional state, and then repeated enough times that the mind starts treating them like a pattern. Bohemian Grove entered modern attention in a way that followed exactly that kind of paths. Not through one single reveal, but through small exposures spread across time. A mention in a report, a reference in a documentary, a short clip circulated online, a few lines of commentary that were never fully connected, but still felt connected in the way the human mind naturally links separated information. And once those fragments exist, they don't stay isolated. They begin to circulate. People repeat them, interpret them, add small assumptions without realizing they are doing it. Over time, the original context weakens, and what remains is a kind of shared outline that feels familiar even when it is not fully accurate. This is one of the reasons Bohemian Grove became part of conspiracy theories for sleep content and late-night narration spaces. Not because there is a single confirmed hidden narrative, but because it sits inside a pattern of incomplete visibility. The idea that something partially observed is more intriguing than something fully explained. At its core, the Grove has been described through official and journalistic channels as a private seasonal gathering associated with a long-established social club in Northern California. That is the stable foundation. It has continuity, structure, and historical documentation. But when that foundation is viewed from a distance, without direct access or lived experience, the edges begin to blur. And blurred edges are where interpretation begins to grow. In some discussions, attention turns toward moments where observers claim to have seen or documented parts of the encampment from outside perspectives. These accounts vary in detail, and they are often filtered through commentary, edits, or second-hand retelling. What remains consistent is not the exact content of those accounts, but the way they were received. With curiosity, with speculation, and sometimes with unease. Not necessarily because anything specific was proven, but because partial visibility creates a psychological gap that people instinctively try to close. The mind prefers continuity over fragmentation. So when information is incomplete, it fills in the missing pieces using assumptions shaped by prior beliefs, cultural narratives, and emotional context. That is how larger interpretations begin to form. And Bohemian Grove, because it already sits at the intersection of privacy and influence, becomes a natural place for those interpretations to attach themselves. It is not the only private institution of its kind, but it is one of the few that has remained consistently present in public conversation for decades, which gives it a kind of narrative durability. The more it is mentioned, the more stable the mental image becomes. A forest, a gathering, a separation from public visibility. And from that simple structure, more complex ideas begin to branch outward. Ideas about how influence operates in informal environments. Ideas about how proximity between individuals can shape decisions without leaving formal records. Ideas about how much of social coordination happens outside the systems that are visible to the public. None of these ideas require Bohemian Grove specifically to exist. But the Grove becomes a reference point where they are often placed. A kind of mental anchor. Something real enough to hold abstract concerns in place. And once a subject becomes an anchor like that, it stops being treated as only a location. It becomes a framework for thinking about how unseen spaces might function in general. That is where its role in modern narrative culture quietly settles. Not as a definitive mystery, but as a recurring reference for uncertainty itself. There is a point in almost every long-running public mystery where the original facts stop changing, but the perception of those facts keeps expanding. Bohemian Grove sits in that exact condition. The documented reality remains relatively stable: a private retreat, a historical organization, a seasonal gathering in a forested area that has been in use for over a century. These are not hidden details. They are established and repeated across multiple credible sources. But perception does not stay within the boundaries of documentation. It moves outward. It collects additional meaning from cultural context, from media fragments, and from the way people talk about it in informal settings where certainty is less important than narrative coherence. And over time, that perception becomes the dominant version of the subject in many spaces, especially online spaces where conspiracy theories for sleep and late-night reflective storytelling thrive, because those environments are not focused on resolving uncertainty. They are focused on sitting inside it. Bohemian Grove becomes part of that atmosphere, not because it is presented as a confirmed hidden system, but because it already contains the right conditions for interpretive expansion. Limited access. Long history. Association with influential figures across different eras. And a physical setting that feels removed from everyday visibility. When these elements combine, the human mind naturally begins to construct meaning around them. Not because it is forced to, but because it is uncomfortable leaving gaps unfilled. There have been journalistic attempts over the years to describe what the Grove is like from outside perspectives or limited entry observations. These descriptions often include references to structured events, performances, speeches, and long-standing traditions. They also emphasize the private nature of the gathering, which is expected given its membership structure. But even detailed descriptions do not fully resolve public curiosity. Because curiosity is not only about facts, it is about access. And access, once restricted, becomes the central emotional focus of the story. This is where interpretation becomes more powerful than information. When people cannot directly observe a place or event, they rely on secondary signals. Commentary, media summaries, selective footage, and the opinions of others all become part of the constructed image. And because these sources are not uniform, the resulting mental picture is also not uniform. It shifts depending on who is thinking about it. Some see a historical private club with predictable traditions. Some see an outdated structure of exclusivity that has continued into the modern era. Some see a symbolic example of how elite social networks operate outside formal institutions. And some simply see uncertainty itself, condensed into a single name. Bohemian Grove, in that sense, is not a single narrative. It is a convergence point for multiple narratives that never fully align. And that lack of alignment is exactly what keeps it present in discussion. Because resolved subjects fade, unresolved ones persist. But it is important, in a grounded sense, to recognize that persistence does not equal evidence of hidden structure. It only reflects sustained interest in incomplete visibility. The grove remains what it has been described as inconsistent documentation, and everything beyond that exists in the space between observation and interpretation. That space is where most conspiracy thinking naturally forms, not because people are trying to mislead themselves, but because the human mind prefers incomplete stories to remain active rather than closed. So the grove continues to exist in two parallel ways. One in the physical world, and one in the collective imagination built around it. And those two versions never fully merge. They simply run alongside each other without resolution. There is a difference between being close to power and being inside it, and that difference is not always visible from the outside. Bohemian Grove often becomes part of that discussion, not because it is officially connected to decision-making in a documented way, but because it represents a setting where proximity and influence naturally overlap. And proximity in human systems is never neutral. People who study social structures often point out that decisions are not made only in formal environments. Meetings, offices, and official proceedings are only one layer. Another layer exists in informal spaces where relationships are built slowly over time. Conversations before meetings. Conversations after meetings. Shared events that are not part of official records. These layers exist in nearly every large system, regardless of country or institution. Bohemian Grove is sometimes placed into that broader framework, not as a confirmed site of political or corporate decision-making, but as an example of how private environments can host interactions between individuals who are otherwise influential in public life. That is where the discussion becomes sensitive, and also where it often becomes speculative. Because once you acknowledge that informal spaces exist, the mind begins to ask how much influence they carry. Not in a direct, transactional sense, but in a gradual, relational sense. How much does repeated contact shape trust? How much does familiarity influence judgment? How much do shared private experiences affect public decisions later on? These are real sociological questions, and they do not require conspiracy thinking to exist. But in the absence of full visibility, they can easily become attached to symbolic places. Bohemian Grove, because of its long history and restricted access, becomes one of those symbolic places. Not necessarily because anything specific is proven to happen there beyond what is documented, but because it sits at the intersection of two ideas that are often difficult to separate in public imagination: privacy and influence. The Grove is described in historical accounts as a private seasonal gathering associated with a long-standing social organization. Within that structure, members participate in traditions, events, and social interaction. That is the stable, documented layer. But when people think about who those members are and what roles they hold in broader society, the interpretation naturally expands beyond the structure itself. This is where the concept of government distance and private proximity becomes relevant in discussion. It is not a formal theory tied specifically to the Grove. It is more of a way people try to describe how public institutions and private relationships sometimes exist in parallel. Governments operate through official channels, but individuals who participate in those systems also exist outside them, in social environments that are not part of public record. And those environments, by their nature, are harder to observe. Bohemian Grove becomes a reference point for that idea because it is one of the few private gatherings that has remained consistently known about, even if not fully observable. And that combination creates a paradox. It is known enough to be discussed, but private enough to remain partially out of view. And in that space between knowing and not seeing, interpretation naturally grows. Not necessarily toward a single conclusion, but toward many possible ones. And those possibilities often reflect the concerns of the observer more than the reality of the place itself. Still, the Grove remains in conversation because it represents something larger than itself in public thought. The idea that influence can exist in spaces that are not fully visible. And that idea does not require confirmation to persist. It only requires uncertainty. When you look closely at how stories like Bohemian Grove evolve over time, something subtle becomes visible underneath all the interpretation. The facts don't really move. What moves is the meaning around them. The documented structure of the Grove remains consistent across most credible descriptions. A private, long-established social club that holds a seasonal retreat in Northern California. That core does not shift. It has historical continuity, and it exists within the broader category of private associations that have always been part of elite social life in one form or another. But the meaning attached to it does not stay stable. It expands, contracts, and reshapes itself depending on the cultural moment. In some eras, it is discussed simply as an exclusive tradition. In others, it becomes part of broader conversations about elite networks, informal influence, and the invisible layers of decision-making that exist outside formal institutions. And in modern online culture, especially in spaces where conspiracy theories for sleep and calm late-night narration are shared, it becomes something even more abstract. Not a claim, not a fact, but a space for thinking. A mental environment where uncertainty is allowed to exist without needing immediate resolution. This is important to understand because Bohemian Grove, in that sense, is not just about the Grove itself anymore. It has become a container for larger anxieties about visibility, transparency, and access. People are not only reacting to what is known, they are reacting to what is not known. And the human mind does not treat absence as neutral. It treats absence as something that must mean something, even if that meaning is not clearly defined. That is where patterns begin to form. Connections are drawn between individuals, institutions, and events that may not be directly related in any causal way, not because people are trying to mislead themselves, but because the brain prefers continuity over fragmentation. A fragmented picture feels incomplete. An incomplete picture feels unstable. So the mind builds bridges. Bohemian Grove becomes one of those bridges in public imagination. Not because it is uniquely secretive compared to all other private institutions, but because it has been consistently present in discourse long enough to accumulate symbolic weight. Over time, that symbolic weight becomes self-sustaining. Even if new information does not fundamentally change the core facts, the narrative continues to grow around them. And this is where the separation between reality and interpretation becomes especially important to recognize. Because in reality, most of what is known about the Grove is tied to its function as a private retreat. Its existence is not hidden. Its general purpose is not unknown. Its history is documented. But interpretation does not stop at function. It moves toward implication. And implication is where uncertainty becomes emotionally charged. That emotional charge is what keeps the subject alive in discussion, especially in reflective or late-night contexts where the goal is not to conclude, but to think slowly through unresolved ideas. Bohemian Grove persists in that space, not as a confirmed hidden system, not as a resolved explanation, but as a reminder of how easily human perception turns partial visibility into narrative structure, and how those structures can feel real even when they are still unfinished. In the end, what remains is not a single answer, but a layered understanding that includes both what is documented and what is imagined around it. And those layers never fully settle. They continue to exist side by side, quietly, without resolution. There is a point, usually very late at night, where thinking stops behaving like analysis and starts behaving more like drifting. One idea doesn't lead to another in a straight line. It just slides. Bohemian Grove often enters that kind of mental space for people who encounter it through documentaries, articles, or fragmented discussions online. Not because it is the most extreme or the most important example of anything, but because it sits in a category the mind doesn't fully close. A private forest gathering. A long history. A sense of distance from everyday visibility. And that combination is enough for the brain to keep returning to it, even when there is no new information. This is where the psychology behind conspiracy theories for sleep becomes more interesting than the theories themselves. Because in these moments, the subject is no longer just Bohemian Grove. It becomes something else entirely. A way of thinking about uncertainty. A way of sitting with questions that don't demand immediate answers. Human cognition is not naturally comfortable with incomplete information. When something feels important but not fully explained, the mind tries to stabilize it. Sometimes that stabilization happens through logic, sometimes through emotion. and sometimes through narrative building, where separate ideas slowly merge into one continuous story. Bohemian Grove sits inside that process because it is both known and not fully seen. That duality matters more than any single claim about it. In documented terms, it is a private seasonal retreat associated with a long-standing social club. That is the stable foundation, but most people who think about it for more than a moment are not thinking only about that foundation. They are thinking about what it represents. Privacy that lasts for decades. Gatherings that are not fully visible. Influential individuals who exist in public roles but also participate in private spaces. These elements are not unusual in themselves. They exist in many parts of society, but when combined in a single mental image, especially one that is repeatedly referenced in media and online discussion, they begin to form something more symbolic. Not because they are secretly connected, but because the mind connects them anyway. This is how symbolic spaces are formed in thought. They are not created by evidence alone. They are created by repetition, curiosity, and the emotional weight of not knowing everything. Bohemian Grove, in this sense, becomes less of a specific location and more of a mental placeholder for questions about visibility. What happens outside public observation? How much of social and political life exists in informal settings? How do relationships formed in private environments influence public outcomes later? These are not conspiracy questions by default. They are structural questions about human behavior. But when placed into an environment with limited access, they begin to feel more mysterious than they are. And mystery, once established, tends to sustain itself. Even when clarity exists in other parts of the subject. There is also something important about the way distance affects perception here. Most people engaging with the idea of Bohemian Grove are not near it. They are not part of its history. They are not observing it directly. They are interacting with representations of it. And representations are always incomplete. They highlight certain details and leave out others, not necessarily on purpose, but because no single perspective can contain the full reality of a complex institution. So the mind fills the gaps, quietly at first, then more consistently, until the filling of gaps becomes part of the experience itself. And that is often where reflection begins to feel like something deeper than it actually is. Not a conclusion, but a process of trying to hold uncertainty in a form that feels stable enough to sit with. Bohemian Grove continues to exist in that form for many people. Not as a fully defined mystery, but as a place where incomplete understanding gathers and lingers. Like thoughts that return without invitation and settle without resolution. There is a reason certain places remain in public imagination long after most of the facts about them have stopped changing. It is rarely because new evidence keeps appearing. More often, it is because the place becomes attached to a feeling. And feelings tend to survive longer than information. Bohemian Grove is one of those places. Not because everyone agrees about what it represents. In many ways, the opposite is true. People rarely agree on what the Grove means. Some see it as a harmless tradition that has survived from another era. Others see it as a symbol of exclusivity. Some view it as a window into how influential people build relationships away from public attention. And some see it as something much larger than any documented evidence supports. Yet, despite all those different interpretations, the subject remains alive. And that persistence tells us something interesting. Sometimes what fascinates people is not the answer. Sometimes it is the existence of the question itself. If you think about it carefully, most mysteries eventually fade. Once a mystery is solved, it loses a certain kind of energy. The unknown becomes known. The unfinished becomes finished. And attention moves elsewhere. But Bohemian Grove occupies a different category. It exists in a place where there is enough information to sustain discussion, but not enough visibility to create complete closure. That balance is surprisingly powerful. Too little information and people lose interest. Too much information and curiosity disappears. But somewhere in the middle, curiosity can survive for decades. Sometimes for generations. And that is exactly where the Grove seems to exist. Imagine for a moment that you know a house exists at the end of a road. You know who owns it. You know when people visit. You know roughly what happens there. But you never actually enter it. You never see the conversations. You never experience the atmosphere. You only hear descriptions from people who have. Over time, that house begins to feel larger than it really is. Not physically larger, psychologically larger. Because the missing details create space. And the human imagination is remarkably efficient at filling space. Bohemian Grove functions in much the same way. The less direct experience people have with it, the more room there is for interpretation. This does not mean the interpretations are accurate, nor does it mean they are false. It simply means they exist. And once an interpretation exists long enough, it begins to develop momentum. The internet accelerated this process dramatically. Before the digital age, information moved slowly. Stories traveled through books, magazines, television programs, and conversations. Today, a fragment can travel around the world in minutes. A photograph, a quote, a short video clip, a single observation. Each fragment becomes detached from its original context and enters a much larger ecosystem of interpretation. The result is that people often encounter the symbol before they encounter the history. They hear the name Bohemian Grove before they learn what the Bohemian Club actually is. They hear speculation before they encounter documentation. And once first impressions form, they are difficult to reverse. The psychologists have studied this phenomenon for years. The first framework through which people encounter information often shapes everything that follows. If someone first encounters Bohemian Grove through a historical article, they may view it primarily as a social institution. If someone first encounters it through a conspiracy documentary, they may view it primarily as a mystery. The facts available to both individuals might eventually become similar. But the emotional framework remains different. And emotional frameworks are powerful. They determine what details stand out, what details are ignored, and what details feel significant. This is one reason why discussions about the Grove often become circular. Different people are not always arguing about the same thing. One person is discussing documented history. Another is discussing symbolism. Another is discussing cultural influence. Another is discussing uncertainty itself. The word Bohemian Grove becomes a container holding multiple conversations simultaneously. And because those conversations overlap, they create the illusion that everyone is discussing a single subject. In reality, they are often discussing completely different ideas connected to the same location. That distinction matters because it explains why the subject remains difficult to resolve. You cannot resolve a question if different people are asking different questions. Some people want to know what happens there. Others want to know why privacy attracts suspicion. Others want to understand how elite social networks function. Others are interested in symbolism, ritual, and public perception. Each of these questions points in a different direction, and yet they all return to the same place. The same forest, the same gathering, the same collection of redwood trees that have stood quietly through countless summers. Those trees are an interesting part of the story themselves, not because they prove anything, but because they shape atmosphere. Atmosphere matters more than most people realize. If Bohemian Grove were located in the middle of an ordinary office complex, public perception would probably be very different. Imagine replacing the redwoods with parking lots, replacing forest pathways with concrete sidewalks, replacing isolation with urban visibility. The entire emotional tone of the subject changes instantly. The setting contributes to the mythology, not intentionally, but inevitably. Humans respond to environments. We always have. A meeting in a skyscraper feels different from a meeting in a mountain lodge. A conversation in a crowded city feels different from a conversation deep inside a forest. The surroundings influence perception long before any facts are introduced. And Bohemian Grove benefits from a setting that naturally encourages imagination. Ancient trees, filtered sunlight, distance from ordinary routines, a sense of separation from everyday life. Even without any conspiracy theories attached to it, that environment would still feel unusual. Add decades of speculation, selective reporting, and cultural fascination, and the psychological effect becomes even stronger. The place begins to feel symbolic before anyone consciously decides it is symbolic. And once symbolism emerges, it becomes self-reinforcing. People do not simply analyze the location. They project onto it concerns about power, concerns about secrecy, concerns about influence, concerns about social hierarchy. The Grove becomes a screen onto which larger societal anxieties are projected. This is not unique to Bohemian Grove. History is full of locations that became symbols for ideas larger than themselves. What makes the Grove interesting is that the symbolic layer and the documented layer continue to exist side by side. Neither fully replaces the other. The documented reality remains. The symbolism remains. And public fascination moves back and forth between them, sometimes emphasizing one, sometimes emphasizing the other, rarely settling completely on either. Perhaps that is why the subject continues to appear in late-night conversations. Not because it offers certainty, but because it resists certainty. People often assume curiosity is driven by answers. In reality, curiosity is often driven by unanswered questions. Questions create movement. Questions create attention. Questions create narrative momentum. And Bohemian Grove contains just enough uncertainty to keep those questions alive. Not enough to prove dramatic conclusions. Not enough to completely dismiss curiosity. Just enough to remain suspended between explanation and interpretation. That suspension is where many enduring mysteries live. Not in darkness, not in revelation, but somewhere in between. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about the psychology surrounding Bohemian Grove. The fascination is not necessarily about what happens there. The fascination is about what the place represents in the human mind. The boundaries, a distance, a partially visible world that seems close enough to imagine, but far enough to remain incomplete. And incomplete things have a peculiar power. They stay with us, long after finished stories are forgotten, long after answers lose their novelty, long after attention moves elsewhere. The question remains, quietly, patiently, like the redwoods themselves, standing still while generations come and go, watching stories grow around them, never confirming them, never denying them, simply remaining there. A real place, a real history, and a mystery that continues less because of what is known and more because of what people feel when they realize they do not know everything. There is a quiet moment that happens in almost every investigation, whether it is conducted by a journalist, a historian, a researcher, or simply a curious person lying awake at night. It is the moment when a pattern first appears. Not a confirmed pattern, not a proven one, just the feeling of a pattern. And strangely enough, that feeling can be far more powerful than the pattern itself. Because once the mind believes it has found a connection, it becomes difficult to stop looking for more. Bohemian Grove often lives inside that exact psychological space. Over the decades, people have collected names, events, photographs, anecdotes, articles, interviews, and observations related to the grove. Most of these pieces are harmless on their own. Some are historically significant. Some are little more than fragments. But when placed together, they begin to create a picture, or at least the appearance of one. And this is where things become interesting. Because human beings are natural pattern detectors. In fact, we are so good at finding patterns that we often find them even when they are not really there. Long before modern civilization existed, this ability helped our ancestors survive. Seeing connections quickly could mean the difference between safety and danger. A movement in tall grass, a change in weather, a familiar sound in the distance. The brain evolved to connect information rapidly because missing a real pattern was often more dangerous than seeing a false one. That tendency never disappeared. It simply adapted itself to the modern world. Today, instead of searching forests for predators, people search information for hidden structures. They search headlines, documents, historical records, networks of relationships. And when enough pieces appear to connect, the feeling of discovery begins. That feeling is powerful, almost addictive, because it creates a sense of order. A sense that scattered events might actually belong to a larger story. This is one reason conspiracy theories remain so attractive across generations. Not necessarily because people want to believe extraordinary claims, but because people want complexity to make sense. A random world can feel uncomfortable. A connected world feels understandable, even if the connections are not always accurate. Bohemian Grove has become a recurring subject in these discussions because it naturally provides raw material for pattern recognition. There is history. There are influential attendees. There is privacy. There is limited visibility, and there is a location that already feels separate from ordinary life. Those ingredients create fertile ground for interpretation. Imagine looking at a night sky. At first you see only individual stars. Then someone points out a constellation. Suddenly you cannot unsee it. The stars have not changed, but your perception has. Now you see structure where before you saw randomness. The same process happens with information. A collection of unrelated facts can suddenly appear connected once a narrative framework is introduced. After that, every additional detail seems to strengthen the pattern. Even when the detail may have multiple explanations. This does not mean people are irrational. It means people are human. And human beings are storytelling creatures. We organize reality through narratives. We always have. The challenge comes when narratives become stronger than the evidence supporting them. That is where caution becomes important. Because patterns exist in different categories. Some patterns are real. Some are partially real. And some exist mostly because the mind wants coherence. Distinguishing between those categories is often difficult, especially when the subject involves incomplete information. Bohemian Grove presents exactly that challenge. There are genuine historical facts surrounding it. There are genuine attendees. There are genuine traditions. There are genuine reports. But around those facts exists a much larger ecosystem of interpretation. And interpretation has a tendency to expand. A photograph becomes a symbol. A meeting becomes a theory. An association becomes a network. A coincidence becomes evidence. Slowly, almost invisibly, the narrative grows. Not through deliberate deception most of the time, but through accumulation. One assumption added to another. One possibility added to another. One unanswered question attached to another unanswered question. Eventually, the collection begins to feel substantial. Not because every piece is confirmed, but because there are so many pieces. And quantity can sometimes create the illusion of certainty. This is one reason why historians are often careful about patterns. They know how persuasive patterns can be. They also know how misleading they can become. History is filled with events that appeared connected from a distance, but looked very different when examined closely. Likewise, history contains events that seemed unrelated until deeper investigation revealed genuine connections. The challenge is knowing which situation you are facing. And that challenge never fully disappears. When people discuss Bohemian Grove, they often find themselves standing in that uncertain territory. Some patterns appear meaningful. Others appear coincidental. Many remain impossible to evaluate completely because direct visibility is limited. So interpretation continues. An interpretation is shaped by expectations. A person who already suspects hidden coordination may see confirmation. A person who expects ordinary explanations may see coincidence. Both individuals can look at the same information and arrive at very different conclusions. Not because the facts changed, but because perception filtered them differently. This is perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire subject. The grove itself remains relatively stable. The interpretations surrounding it do not. They shift with culture. They shift with politics. They shift with public trust. During periods when institutions are trusted, people tend to view private gatherings differently. During periods when institutions are distrusted, the same gatherings suddenly feel more significant. The facts remain largely unchanged. The emotional environment changes, and emotional environments influence how patterns are perceived. A connection that seems meaningful in one era might seem ordinary in another. A coincidence that appears suspicious during uncertainty may appear harmless during stability. Human perception is never completely separate from context. It cannot be. We interpret information through the lens of the world we believe we are living in. And perhaps that is why Bohemian Grove continues to survive as a topic of fascination. Not because it continuously produces new revelations, but because each generation projects its own concerns onto it. One generation worries about political influence. Another worries about corporate powers. Another worries about transparency. Another worries about institutions becoming too distant from the public. The grove becomes a screen for those concerns, a place where broader anxieties gather. And because those anxieties change over time, the interpretation changes too. Yet the underlying question remains remarkably consistent. How much of the world is shaped by things we cannot fully see? It is an old question, much older than Bohemian Grove, much older than modern conspiracy theories. People have been asking versions of it for centuries. The names change. The locations change. The institutions change. But the question survives. And perhaps that is why certain stories never truly disappear. Because they are attached not to answers, but to questions. Questions that remain permanently unfinished. Questions that invite reflection without demanding resolution. Questions that linger quietly in the background long after the conversation ends. Bohemian Grove has become one of those questions. Not necessarily because it provides extraordinary evidence, but because it occupies a space where certainty never completely settles. A place where patterns seem visible, and where the possibility always exists that some of those patterns are exactly what they appear to be, while others are only shapes created by the human desire to connect the dots. And from a distance, especially late at night, it is not always easy to tell the difference. If there is one thing that repeatedly appears throughout the history of conspiracy theories, it is not secrecy. It is pattern recognition. People often assume conspiracies begin with hidden information, but many of them actually begin somewhere much simpler. They begin with a connection, or what appears to be a connection. A person notices two events that seem related, then three, then five. Eventually, a larger structure begins to emerge. And once that structure appears, the mind becomes invested in it. Not because it has been proven, but because it feels meaningful. That feeling is important. Perhaps more important than many people realize. Because human beings do not experience reality as isolated facts. We experience reality as stories. The stories give events context. The stories explain why things happen. The stories turn confusion into understanding. And when a story appears capable of explaining many different events at once, it becomes very attractive. Bohemian Grove exists inside exactly this kind of storytelling environment. Not because it provides a complete explanation for anything, but because it often appears in the middle of larger narratives that people are already trying to construct. Imagine looking at a giant map spread across a table. The map contains thousands of roads. Most roads go nowhere particularly interesting. Some connect major cities. Others end abruptly. Now imagine noticing that several different routes seem to pass through the same location. Immediately, that location feels important. Not necessarily because it actually is, but because your attention has been drawn there repeatedly. Bohemian Grove functions like that on the mental maps people build about power, influence, and secrecy. Again and again, certain discussions seem to pass through it. A conversation about elite social networks. A discussion about private retreats. An article about influential individuals. A documentary exploring hidden structures. Soon the location begins to feel central, even if its actual role remains uncertain. This is one of the most fascinating effects of repeated association. Association alone can create significance. The more often something appears within important conversations, the more important it begins to seem. And eventually, people stop asking whether it belongs in those conversations. They assume it does. That assumption becomes part of the narrative foundation itself. Over time, layers accumulate. A historical fact becomes attached to a symbolic interpretation. That symbolic interpretation becomes attached to another theory. That theory becomes attached to a broader cultural concern. Before long, the original subject is carrying far more meaning than it ever did on its own. This process is not unique to Bohemian Grove. It happens constantly. Throughout history, certain locations have become symbolic centers for fears, hopes, suspicions, and unanswered questions. What makes the Grove interesting is how many different themes have gradually attached themselves to it. Power, privacy, tradition, influence, exclusivity, secrecy, networking, institutional trust, public perception. All of these themes overlap around the same place. And because they overlap, the place begins to feel larger than itself. But feeling larger than itself does not necessarily mean being larger than itself. That distinction is easy to lose, especially after years of repeated discussion. Consider how often people encounter information through fragments. Very rarely does someone spend weeks studying a subject from beginning to end. More often, they encounter isolated pieces of video clips, a headline, a podcast discussion, a social media post, a brief mention in a documentary. Each fragment arrives independently. The brain naturally attempts to organize them into a coherent structure. And coherence feels satisfying. In many ways, the desire for coherence is one of the strongest forces shaping human belief. We prefer complete pictures to incomplete ones. We prefer explanations to uncertainty. We prefer narratives to randomness. This preference is neither good nor bad. It is simply human. The challenge comes when coherence becomes more persuasive than evidence. Because evidence is often messy. Real life is messy. History is messy. Institutions are messy. Human behavior is messy. The stories are kleiner. Stories organize complexity into understandable forms. And when a story seems to explain enough pieces at once, it becomes difficult to let go of. This is why some conspiracy narratives survive for decades, even when major parts of them remain unproven. They provide structure. They reduce uncertainty. They answer questions that otherwise remain open. Bohemian Grove occupies a unique position within this landscape because it is not purely fictional, nor is it fully transparent. It exists in the middle, and middle spaces are where imagination thrives. If the Grove were completely hidden, people would have little to discuss. If it were completely open, much of the speculation would disappear. Instead, it exists in a narrow zone between those extremes. visible enough to attract attention, private enough to sustain curiosity. That balance has allowed it to remain culturally relevant for generations. What is especially interesting is how different people use the grove to support entirely different conclusions. For some, it represents the dangers of excessive secrecy. For others, it represents the importance of private spaces where influential individuals can interact freely. For some, it is evidence of broader hidden structures. For others, it is evidence only of how easily humans become fascinated by exclusivity. These interpretations often contradict each other, yet they all continue to coexist. The reason is simple. The subject never fully resolves, and unresolved subjects can support multiple narratives simultaneously. A solved puzzle produces one answer. An unsolved puzzle produces many. Bohemian Grove remains closer to the second category. Not because there are no facts. There are facts. Not because there is no history. There is history. Not because there are no records. There are records. But because the emotional significance attached to those facts keeps expanding beyond the facts themselves. Every generation inherits the subject and adds something new to it. A new concern, a new framework, a new interpretation. The result is a narrative that continuously evolves, while the underlying location remains largely unchanged. The redwoods remain. The seasonal gatherings remain. The discussions remain. And the questions remain. Perhaps that is why the phrase, "all roads seem to lead to Bohemian Grove," has such staying power. Not because every road literally does. Clearly they do not. But because once a location becomes symbolically important, people begin noticing every road that passes near it. And they begin forgetting the roads that do not. That is another characteristic of human perception. Our attention is selective. We remember what reinforces our expectations. We overlook what does not. Gradually, the pattern grows stronger in our minds. Not necessarily because reality changed, but because focus changed. And focus is powerful. Powerful enough to shape memory. Powerful enough to shape interpretation. Powerful enough to shape entire narratives. By the time people realize this process is happening, the narrative often feels completely natural, as though it was always there, as though the connections were obvious from the beginning. Yet many of those connections emerged slowly, piece by piece, through years of repetition. This does not invalidate them, nor does it confirm them. It simply reminds us that meaning is often built rather than discovered. And Bohemian Grove may be one of the clearest examples of that process in modern conspiracy culture. A real place. A real history. A real institution. Surrounded by layers of interpretation that continue growing decade after decade. Not because anyone can fully explain it, but because nobody can fully close the conversation either. And so the discussion continues. Quietly, patiently, moving from one generation to the next, like a road disappearing into a forest, always visible for a while, never visible all the way to the end. Eventually, after enough articles have been read, enough documentaries have been watched, enough interviews have been quoted, and enough theories have been repeated, a person arrives at a surprisingly quiet place. Not an answer, just a quieter question. That question is not usually, what is Bohemian Grove? By this point in the journey, most people already know the basic facts. They know it is a private retreat. They know it has existed for a long time. They know influential individuals have attended over the decades. They know it sits among the redwoods of Northern California. They know it has become a recurring subject in discussions about elite networks, private influence, and unexplained connections. They know. The quieter question comes later. The quieter question is this: why does it continue to hold attention? Because if we are honest, there are many private organizations in the world. Many exclusive gatherings. Many institutions that operate outside public visibility. Most of them receive very little sustained interest. Most of them fade into the background of public awareness. Yet Bohemian Grove remains. Year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. And perhaps the reason has less to do with the grove itself than with something deeper inside human psychology. Because human beings have always been fascinated by boundaries. A boundary is a strange thing. It is not a wall. It is not necessarily a barrier. It is simply a line between what is accessible and what is inaccessible. And throughout history, boundaries have attracted curiosity. The edge of an unexplored forest. The horizon beyond the ocean. The door to a private room. The archive that remains sealed. The conversation that happens after everyone else leaves. The moment something moves beyond observation, attention often follows it. Not because people are irrational, because people are curious. And curiosity naturally gravitates toward limits. Bohemian Grove functions as one of those limits. A place that can be discussed but not fully observed. A place that can be described but not completely experienced by outsiders. A place that exists within public awareness while remaining partially beyond public access. That combination is remarkably rare. and rarity itself generates attention. The human brain assigns value to scarcity almost automatically. Things that are available everywhere rarely become obsessions. Things that remain limited often do. Not always because they are important. Sometimes simply because they are limited. This is one reason exclusivity carries such psychological weight. When access is restricted, the object of attention changes. People stop focusing only on what is happening. They start focusing on the fact that they cannot see it happening. The restriction itself becomes part of the narrative. Perhaps even the most important part. In many discussions surrounding Bohemian Grove, this dynamic is easy to observe. Different people disagree about what the grove means. Different people disagree about its significance. Different people disagree about the conclusions that should be drawn from its existence. Yet they often share one thing in common. They remain interested. And sustained interest requires fuel. That fuel is rarely certainty. Certainty ends conversations. Uncertainty extends them. The grove survives because uncertainty survives. Because no matter how many explanations are offered, there always seems to be a small amount of unresolved space remaining. A small opening where another question can emerge. And questions have remarkable endurance. Much greater endurance than answers. Think about historical mysteries that continue attracting attention hundreds of years later. Many survive not because they are unsolved in a technical sense, but because the available explanations never feel emotionally complete. A something remains. A gap. A missing piece. A lingering doubt. Bohemian Grove occupies a similar psychological territory. Not necessarily because there is a hidden answer waiting to be discovered, but because the subject contains enough ambiguity to remain permanently open to interpretation. And interpretation is where human imagination does some of its most interesting work. When people encounter incomplete information, they rarely leave it incomplete. Instead, they begin constructing models. Possible explanations. Possible connections. Possible meanings. Most of these models are never fully confirmed. Many are never fully disproven. They simply coexist. One possibility beside another. One narrative beside another. One interpretation beside another. Over time, these interpretations accumulate. They form layers. And eventually, those layers become almost impossible to separate from the original subject. This is particularly true in the digital age. Information moves differently now than it did in the past. A theory can spread globally within hours. A photograph can be analyzed by thousands of people simultaneously. A short clip can generate years of discussion. And every discussion adds another layer. Not necessarily another fact, but another layers. That distinction matters. Facts and layers are not the same thing. Facts describe. Layers interpret. Bohemian Grove has accumulated an extraordinary number of layers over the years. Some historical, some political, some cultural, some psychological, some speculative, some symbolic. Together they create a subject that feels much larger than its physical dimensions. A forest retreat becomes a cultural phenomenon. A private gathering becomes a public mystery. A location becomes an idea. And ideas travel much farther than places. In fact, most people who discuss Bohemian Grove will never visit it, never see it, never experience it directly. What they encounter instead is the idea of Bohemian Grove. The symbolic version. The version built through stories, documentaries, articles, debates, and late-night reflections. That symbolic version often becomes more influential than the physical reality. Not because it is more accurate, but because it is more widely shared. Ideas are easier to distribute than experiences. And once an idea begins circulating, it develops a life of its own. Sometimes it grows. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes it becomes disconnected from its origin. Yet it continues moving, carried by conversation, carried by curiosity, carried by the simple human desire to understand how the world works behind the scenes. This desire is ancient, far older than modern conspiracy theories. People have always wondered what happens beyond visible systems. What conversations occur outside public view? What relationships shape events before those events become visible? These questions existed long before Bohemian Grove. They will continue long after it. The Grove simply became one location where those questions found a home. And perhaps that is why it remains so compelling. Not because it provides answers, but because it provides a setting for questions that never fully disappear. Questions about power, questions about visibility, questions about trust, questions about influence, questions about what happens beyond the edges of ordinary observation. And as long as those questions remain part of human experience, places like Bohemian Grove will continue to attract attention. Not necessarily because they are extraordinary, but because they sit at the intersection of curiosity and uncertainty. A place where answers are never quite complete, and where silence often speaks louder than certainty, And perhaps that is where the story was always leading. Not toward a revelation, not toward a hidden document, not toward a final piece of evidence that suddenly explains everything, but toward the realization that some subjects survive precisely because they never become complete. Bohemian Grove may be one of those subjects. If you trace the discussion back through the years, through newspaper archives, magazine features, television reports, books, interviews, documentaries, internet forums, podcasts, and countless late-night conversations, something becomes clear. The central facts remain surprisingly stable. The location remains the same. The organization remains the same. The seasonal gathering remains the same. The redwoods remain the same. What changes is everything surrounding those facts. The interpretations, the assumptions, the concerns of the era, the questions people bring with them when they approach the subject. Those things change constantly, and perhaps that tells us something important. Perhaps the enduring fascination with Bohemian Grove has never been entirely about Bohemian Grove. Perhaps it has also been about us, about the way human beings respond to uncertainty, about the way we react when visibility ends and imagination begins. Because the truth is that most people do not spend their lives surrounded by complete information. We live among fragments. A conversation overheard. A headline half remembered. A photograph without context. A decision whose origins remain invisible. A relationship whose influence is difficult to measure. The world often arrives in pieces, and the human mind is constantly trying to assemble those pieces into something coherent. That effort never really stops. Even in sleep, even in dreams, even in those quiet hours of the night when thoughts drift more slowly than usual. We search for patterns. We search for explanations. We search for stories capable of connecting separate events into meaningful structures. Sometimes those structures are accurate. Sometimes they are not. Most often they contain elements of both. That is why certainty can be so difficult. Reality rarely arrives in neat categories. And subjects like Bohemian Grove exist right in the middle of that complexity. There are things that are known. There are things that are unknown. And between those two territories lies an enormous landscape of interpretation. A landscape where theories grow. A landscape where assumptions compete. A landscape where different people can examine the same information and arrive at entirely different conclusions. For some observers, Bohemian Grove represents little more than a private tradition that has survived from another era. For others, it represents a symbol of elite exclusivity. For others still, it serves as a lens through which larger concerns about influence, access, and institutional trust can be explored. None of these interpretations completely erase the others. They simply coexist. And because they coexist, the conversation never reaches a final destination. It continues, year after year, generation after generation, like a road that never quite ends. Perhaps that image is fitting. After all, the title of this journey began with a question about roads. Why do so many roads seem to lead to Bohemian Grove? At first glance, the answer appears obvious. People encounter the grove repeatedly while exploring subjects related to power, influence, private networks, and historical institutions. The name appears again and again. Unrepeated appearances create significance. But there may be another answer as well. A quieter answer. Perhaps the roads seem to lead there because once a place becomes symbolic, people begin using it as a destination for questions that extend far beyond the place itself. Questions about how societies function. Questions about who holds influence. Questions about what happens beyond public visibility. Questions about whether the systems we see are the only systems operating around us. Those roads are not really leading to a forest in Northern California. They are leading toward uncertainty. And uncertainty has always attracted attention. Not because uncertainty is comfortable. Quite the opposite. Uncertainty creates tension. It creates curiosity. It creates movement. It encourages people to keep looking, to keep reading, to keep wondering. And that process can continue indefinitely because uncertainty rarely disappears completely. Even when answers arrive, new questions often replace them. That is one reason enduring mysteries remain culturally powerful. Not because they are unsolvable, but because they are renewable. Each generation finds something new within them. A new concern, a new interpretation, a new perspective. Bohemian Grove has experienced exactly that process. The concerns attached to it today are not necessarily the same concerns attached to it 50 years ago. And 50 years from now, they may be different again. Yet the subject will likely remain, because the underlying themes remain. Visibility, privacy, influence, trust, like this, power. These themes are permanent parts of human society. As long as they exist, places associated with them will continue attracting attention. And perhaps that is why the Grove never fully leaves public imagination. Not because it is uniquely mysterious. Not because it contains all the answers. But because it sits at the intersection of questions that people never stop asking, and questions that existed long before the grove, and questions that will exist long after it. By now, the rain outside may feel softer. The room may feel quieter. The thoughts that seemed sharp at the beginning of this journey may have become slower and more distant. That is often what happens when a mystery is approached gently rather than aggressively. The goal is no longer to solve it. The goal is simply to understand why it exists, why it persists, why it continues returning to conversation after conversation, year after year. And perhaps the answer is surprisingly simple. Bohemian Grove survives because it occupies a space that the human mind finds endlessly interesting. A space between knowledge and uncertainty, between visibility and privacy, between documentation and interpretation. Most subjects eventually move entirely into one category or the other. They become fully understood, or they disappear from attention altogether. The grove did neither. It remained in the middle, and middle spaces have remarkable staying power because they leave room for imagination, room for curiosity, room for reflection, room for stories. As the night grows quieter, it becomes easier to see that this may be the real mystery. Not what happens inside the grove, but why places like it capture attention so consistently. Why some questions stay alive while others fade. Why certain stories continue traveling through generations even when no definitive conclusion ever arrives. The redwoods do not answer those questions. The forest remains silent. The roads remain where they have always been. And somewhere among those roads sits a place that has become larger in imagination than it could ever be in geography. A real place, a real history, and a reminder that sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not the ones hidden from view. They are the ones that remain just visible enough to keep us wondering. And with that thought drifting quietly into the distance, the story reaches its end. Not with certainty, not with revelation, but with the same gentle uncertainty that has followed it from the beginning. A question carried through a forest, a question carried through time, and a question that perhaps was never meant to be answered completely.